This is Jay Callahan again, and this is another one of our video mini lectures. In this video, we're going to talk about coping, support, and meaning. Okay, coping, support, and meaning are the three themes that we'll be focusing on when we actually talk about the problem-solving model of crisis intervention. But so first, in this video, I want to just kind of introduce these topics so we'll know what we're talking about together. So first, coping mechanisms. So coping mechanisms, and this is pretty much the way we use this in everyday life. Coping mechanisms are conscious or almost conscious mechanisms that people use to deal with the world, to deal with stress, to deal with demands from the outside, activities, things we do. And there's numerous kinds of different coping mechanisms. In scholarly work, coping mechanisms are sometimes divided up into problem-focused, which means actually things to do to try to fix the problem. Emotion-focused, which obviously means focusing on the emotions that are stirred up by the problem. Avoidance, which I guess is pretty clear. And then acceptance. So this is one way to think about it. And as I mentioned, there's numerous examples. So if you think about what you do or what people you know do when they are in stressful situations, even minor daily stressful situations, then you can think of things like actively planning about what to do about it, talking to one's family, walking in the woods, drinking, exercise, journaling, socializing. You can see all the things I put on the slide, all kinds of different activities. And later we'll also talk about how we want to think about these as mostly constructive and adaptive versus some that are destructive and maladaptive. Easy, quick example would be drinking and drugs. Past light social use, drinking and drugs can be a way to cope with stressful situations, but unfortunately a pretty maladaptive way to cope. Okay, so we talked about that. Productive and healthy or maladaptive and unhealthy. Next is support, and I think that's kind of self-explanatory. We're talking about either emotional or concrete support from significant others or from one's what we typically call a support system. We also need to keep in mind that when people are in a crisis or they've been dealing with stressful situations, that in some cases there are formal support groups to support people who have been in those situations. Rape support, domestic violence, survivors of suicide, as I've mentioned, that I've been involved in before. Survivors of suicide meaning people who have had someone in their family die of suicide. And I want to mention a kind of a special point here about support, which I call homecoming. And this is kind of my thing. This is not based on any research or literature. Well, it's based on the study about Vietnam veterans that we talked about before. But let me explain. So homecoming is the initial support or lack of support after a person has experienced a traumatic event from their significant others. The first thing, what happens the first time they meet with their family, the first time they see their significant other, first time they come home, what is the reaction of people? And what I'm arguing here is that initial reaction is super important, even if it changes later. Because if the initial impact, the initial reaction of significant others is negative, that seems to color everything that goes on after that, even if the same people become more supportive and positive later. So the first piece of evidence I would offer for that is the Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study that I referred to earlier, the one where they were able to discern that the Vietnam veterans who had been physically abused as children were more likely to have PTSD and more likely to have more severe PTSD from combat. Okay, remember that? Well, that same survey of Vietnam veterans also looked at homecoming, what they called homecoming, and that was what sort of reaction did these veterans, these soldiers, get when they returned to the United States. And now this is before most of your time, but one of the unfortunate things that happened, as the Vietnam War got more and more unpopular in the early 70s especially, then the public, people in general, tended to have a very negative attitude about the individual soldiers. And in retrospect, I think it's pretty easy to see that the negative reaction should have been solely at policymakers, the government, and people in the military, but people in the public took it out on the individual soldiers. So sometimes individual soldiers flew back to the United States, and often they had a very quick transition. They'd leave Vietnam and be back in the U.S. 24 hours later, and as they walked through the airport with the uniform on, people spit on them, and people called them baby killers and things like that. It was a very negative homecoming and experience for many of them. Many of these soldiers took off their uniform and then didn't tell people where they had been for the last year or two, to hide that experience. So that's the first issue, that homecoming was really important. And in fact, in that study, it turned out that the soldiers who had gotten a negative homecoming, as I just described, were also more likely to have PTSD and more severe PTSD than the soldiers who had had a positive or welcoming homecoming. The second piece of evidence here is just my experience or my discussions with other people. When I was in charge of psychiatric emergency services in Ann Arbor, we also had another agency which was part of community mental health, which was a rape crisis center. And we did my program, our outreach workers did some of the outreach on off hours, weekends, and evenings for rape victims that showed up at one of the hospital emergency rooms. And so because of that connection, and just because personally I knew some of the women that were in charge of the Rape Crisis Center, we had some talks about a number of issues. And one of the things that stuck out to me that was interesting was that now this is 35 years ago. Things have changed now, I think, pretty much, maybe not entirely. And by that I mean that back in those days it was not that rare for a woman who had been sexually assaulted or raped to come home only to find the men in their family, the fathers or the brothers or the husbands or the boyfriends, to say, to blame the victim. To what were you doing in that bar or that restaurant? What were you dressed like? What were you doing out at night? A lot of victim blaming kinds of reactions. And because of that, and because that was fairly common, the Rape Crisis Center set up a series of public lectures at other locations where they would essentially try to educate people in the public, as well, especially as the family members of rape victims, to the reality what rape is like, and hopefully to get people away from the blaming the victim stance. And they said that these presentations were fairly successful, and they were able to change people's minds. It was a success as a program. But one of the wrinkles that came out of that I was told was that in many cases, some of the women, some of the rape victims who had received that initial negative reaction, that blaming reaction from the men or women, but from the people in their family, from their significant others, some of those people then went to one of these lecture programs and they changed their tune and they developed a more positive attitude, and they realized that a rape victim is a rape victim, that she is not to blame. And so they changed their tune and they became much more supportive. But the clients, the rape victims, said in their confidential sessions that although they certainly welcomed that, it was certainly better than the earlier attitude, it didn't really erase how much it cut to get that first criticism, that first lack of support. So I took that idea and put that together with the idea of homecoming for Vietnam veterans, and have come to believe that support is important across the board, but the initial support from significant others is particularly important, and the initial lack of support from significant others is particularly destructive and harmful as well. And then third, we're going to talk about meaning. And meaning is, the meaning of the event to the person. What does the individual take from or make of the stressful situation or the stressful event? It's developing an account and an explanation of what happened. And sometimes it can be on a fairly deep level, an existential level. Sometimes not. So it could be fairly superficial. And an easy example here is job loss. So if a job loss is the event, we can say on the one hand, a college student who loses a job, it's trivial. they don't care. They're like, oh, it's good. I hated that job anyway. I need someone to give me a push to get something different. Whereas for a middle-aged male who is the breadwinner for his family, losing a job could be catastrophic, that they might really feel unable to get another job, and that lack of job, lack of being able to be the breadwinner means the loss of value of them as a provider and as a human being. It can be very profound. And in fact, that's where we talked before about going postal. That was clearly the meaning that some of those postal workers drew out of their getting fired or getting laid off, that they would never get another job, that they would never get another good job with good benefits, and therefore they were a failure as a human being, and for many of them, failure as a man, because the man's role is to be the provider. So it can be on that level, which I would still say is fairly superficial, or it can be very profound, again, on a kind of an existential level. There was a plane crash of a small plane in northwest Indiana about 10 years ago, and I believe about 10 people died. In fact, the only person that survived was the pilot, and it was he was in the hospital, and he barely survived. But when he eventually came around and eventually woke up and was alert and asked the doctors and nurses what happened, and they explained that his plane had crashed, the first words out of his mouth were, "Why did God do this to me?" So you can see that that's a whole different level of meaning, and a profoundly negative level of meaning than some of the other situations that we might come across. So as another example of meaning, I would again refer back to my experience with survivors of suicide, and an interesting article I just saw, which I also found in my own experience, that to have someone that you're close to die of suicide is, in most cases, a profoundly upsetting, disturbing, obviously traumatic event. Remember the third category of traumatic event, learning this happens to somebody that you care about. But there can be different meanings that people can draw from it. In this recent study, I saw there were a number of people who lost someone to suicide, and the major meaning to them is to realize that suicide is something that can really happen in real life. It wasn't real to them before, it became real, and then going forward, that changed them in some ways and changed their relationships with others, but not that much around suicide itself, more around life and existence and things like that. Another group also who have lost people to suicide were grieving, as was the first group. But the process led them to believe that suicide is more acceptable, and that perhaps it really might even be an option for them, that it made it more possible for them to go on to die of suicide. And this is the contagion factor that you may have heard about. We'll talk more about later, that suicide sometimes runs in families, and suicide can be contagious to people all around them. But still, another group in the study saw the pain, the destruction that the suicide caused in the family and the friends, and it made it less acceptable to them. It made it seem like, no, that's something I could never do. So the same situation, the same suicide could lead to very different meanings to people, and then different behavior, following after that. So in summary then, talking about coping, support, and meaning, this leads us to talk about crisis again. And again, these are the main themes in the model of crisis intervention we'll be talking about starting in the next video, or maybe the 2 from now. But the theme at this point is that a person will not have a crisis if they have a constructive and healthy way of coping, that they have a support system that's helpful, that they are willing to utilize, and that the meaning of the event is fairly benign and not world-shattering for them. So if all those things are in place, they're not likely to have a crisis. And if their coping mechanisms works, that's just another definition of crisis. A crisis is when a person's normal coping mechanisms don't work. So if their normal coping mechanisms do work, then almost by definition, it's not a crisis. But if any of these three are not present, So, for example, if their coping mechanisms are destructive or maladaptive, if they don't have a support system, or if their support system becomes judgmental or unhelpful, or if they have a very negative or malignant meaning to the event. Again, a college job loss is no big deal, but a middle-aged man who is the support of his family might feel, I'll never get another job, I'm a failure, and it could have a very catastrophic meaning. Okay, coping and support meaning. We'll be talking more about this as we go on. Okay, so I'll see you next time.